Welcome, everyone, to another Facebook Live broadcast here. Glad to have you along with me on the journey tonight. Tonight, I have Dr. David Gruder. He is a clinical and organizational psychologist, an 8 award-winning author, a highly sought-after speaker, trainer, trusted advisor. I would say, as far as I know, the foremost expert on integrity. And he has done some amazing work around the world and for lots of different organizations. I have the honor of teaching with him on occasion at CEO Space, a wonderful organization that helps fast-growing businesses grow well. I think that might be the best way to say it. They bring some amazing people in there, and I'm honored to be part of that. So without much further ado, I know we're going to have a good conversation here. David, welcome to the show. We have a little bit of latency here. Sorry, guys. So David.
Well, thank you. And just the problems, so there's a little delay.
No problem at all.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Tony.
Thank you. So we have a lot of topics we could talk about tonight, and I often talk about business topics on here or motivation. But as we were kind of communicating back and forth about what we could, really bring to the people that are following this, there's not a new topic, but there's a topic that you've really been exploring in some depth. And, in short, it's about replacing racism, and your perspective on this got me really thinking. And so I want to explore that tonight. I want to go down that path tonight because it's something that I think, as you said, is before we got on the show, we're two white guys, but we got to talk about this as white guys, right? We've got to understand the perspective that we have and the perspectives that are out there. And these are not comfortable topics to talk about, because we may realize things in ourselves that we didn't know were there. Or we may not realize how we have been behaving or reacting to different situations. And so I think it's good for us to have these conversations in a authentic, compassionate, I like to use the term fiercely compassionate way. And that helps all of us to grow in that. So I am grateful that you are here with me. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you just to kind of kick it off a little bit around this idea of replacing racism, what it kind of means at a high level to you, and maybe kind of the genesis of the idea.
Sure. Well, there are a couple of geneses to, if that's the plural genesis, to this idea. One has to do with the word racism. The other has to do with my own history. Let me touch on the word race first and maybe go from there into my own personal history with this. In thinking about solutions to racism, and I because I love words, I started looking for a word that was the absence or opposite of racism, a word that represented what racism wasn't. And what I, of course, found was a lot of words that captured aspects of the absence of racism, like equity and brotherhood and sisterhood and all kinds of really good words. But I did not find a single word that captured all of those attributes of the absence of racism. And because of that, I kind of put my linguist's hat on because I love words. And there's a term from the field of linguistics called empty category. And what an empty category is when a phenomenon is occurring that has no name. And when a phenomenon is occurring that has no name, there's no way to have good conversations about it, and there's no way to really develop conscious relationship with that. We don't have a word for the opposite of racism in the English language. And that's stunning to me because in the absence of a word for the opposite of racism, it's really hard to have really unifying, uplifting discussions about it. So that's the one of the starting places for me.
It's interesting you say that, and a couple ideas come to mind here as I hear that. One is I read an article several years ago now, but they talked about how there was no word for blue in, it may have been the Greek culture, I think it was. And so therefore they talk about the wine colored seas. And so they didn't have a way to describe the color of blue as we see it today. And there are other things like that where cultures don't have words for specific things, so they literally can't see what's there. That's kind of one thought that struck me as I was reading your piece and we were talking about this. The other thing that really
Yes.
struck me is how we, if social media in conversations, when you talk about the opposite or try to talk about the opposite of racism, if you use equality, people get caught up in economic equality, which is not necessarily, related. It can be, but it's not always. Or if you talk about justice, they may be looking at the present moment versus something deeper and systematic. So it seems to me it is a really hard topic to have an honest and authentic, that fiercely compassionate conversation about, because we don't have the word.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. I agree. And that for me was the starting place, because if I couldn't find a word that was the opposite of racism, perhaps there would be a way to describe the ingredients that could go into the recipe that would reveal whatever that word is, which I still don't have. But I do have a sense of some of the ingredients, and where some of these ingredients really come from for me. There, if it's all right with you, I want to talk about two origins of the ingredients I think we'll end up talking about. One is from my own personal history. I grew up Jewish in a community that was a very mixed community. We had Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. We had people from European descent. We had people from Central American and Caribbean descent. We had people from African descent. We were in my community a melting pot, and by and large, that was really an asset. That was a source of opportunities to collaborate. On the other hand, the year that I was bar mitzvahed, when I was 13 years old, that school year, which was my 8th grade school year, I was regularly, while walking home from school, ambushed by a group of white Catholic boys, and not just verbally abused and taunted, but beaten up physically. And while I was being beaten up by this group of boys, I was being accused of having killed Jesus,
Wow.
because their what they had decided or had concluded from their influences in their lives was that it was the Jews that killed the savior of the Catholic Church, and of course the Protestant Church as well, but these were Catholic boys. And so, I have a light-skinned complexion, and so I can pass as whatever type of white I want to pass as, but I have experienced firsthand what it means to be a target. I know what privilege is. And by the way, and we should come back and talk about that, because I don't feel guilt about unearned privilege. What I feel is great grief that not everyone has unearned privilege.
Yeah.
So there's unearned privilege. There is also unearned targeting. And while we talk a lot about unearned privilege, we don't talk as much about unearned targeting. Blacks, unless they're very, very light-skinned and have a lot of Caucasian types of features, blacks can't pass for white. So that's a whole different experience. And I don't equate my experience with the black experience. What I do want to emphasize as a white person is that virtually every white person has at some point or another been in situations where they have not been part of a privilege group, they've been part of a target group. And developing connection with ways in which we white people have been targets, unjustly targeted, is the beginning of compassion. It's the beginning of reaching into the edges of empathy. So that's one piece. There's another piece I want to get into in terms of my background. But before I do that, was there anything you wanted to follow up on that first?
Well, it's interesting because I do want to come back to the unearned privilege, because that's something that I admit it's been hard for me to really wrap my head around. I would say the last few years I've been trying to understand that. So I want to come back to that piece of it, and the context, the emotion related to that. But I also think this is interesting, the unearned targeting, because of where I grew up. I was a Catholic boy, right? But where I grew up in a small town, predominantly white. I mean, there was a few Native Americans that lived in the area, one or two black families. There's very few of anything else. It's central Wisconsin, right? And so, but there was a way to group people there. I went to a very small private school, and so we were of that group, and they had their own nicknames for us. And when we looked at them, they were the townies or whatever else, right? There was a nickname for them. And so we have this innate part of us, and maybe we'll come back to this too, to group ourselves for a sense of safety and belonging. But at the same time, it also is a trigger for attack and targeting. And so I maybe we'll come back to that a little bit too, but that just strikes me as something that people have to understand, that part of human nature. And at the same time, we have to catch ourselves when we are creating those groups and those labels.
Yes, exactly, because they're the golden side of that grouping is a sense of affiliation, a sense of connectedness, a sense of being like-mindedness or like-heartedness or like-spiritedness or like-missionedness. And there's gold in that. The lead, if I can use an alchemy metaphor, transforming from lead into gold, the lead in that is the temptation to make my group affiliation, whatever that happens to be, better than yours, superior to yours, to find ways to ridicule yours and prop up mine. That's the leaden side of something that's very golden about affiliation, connection, safety, closeness. I don't mean like safety as in people are going to get mugged or things like that. I mean the emotional safety that comes from people who think like us. And that's human nature. So yeah, let's double back to all of that. The second piece that I want to give credit to, though, first, if I can, is the Mankind Project. So the Mankind Project is an international nonprofit organization of men mentoring men mentoring each other into mature manhood by addressing and resolving whatever stands between each of us as individual men and living in integrity with whatever our particular mission happens to be. And a big thread in the Mankind Project is around what they call isms and issues. And so this is about men developing conscious relationship with their helpful and destructive beliefs around power, privilege, and diversity. And not just about racism, but all of the isms, sexism and politicalism, because we should talk about that too, because that's the last remaining source of socially sanctioned hatred.
Wow.
So that's
Yes.
another ism that deserves to be talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But it's through fairly extensive training in the Mankind Project that I, as a certified ritual elder in the Mankind Project, have done a lot of exploring and facing around my own um, racism programming background, unconscious entitlements, unconscious privilege that I didn't even recognize as privilege, things along those lines. So I want to credit my own history with alerting me to direct experiences of what it's like to be an unearned target, and with the Mankind Project for really expanding my understanding of the isms and how to deal with isms in good ways. So that's where I wanted to give credit.
Yeah, I appreciate that because it's something that I mean, I look at it. I've got two daughters; they're 14 and 16, and we have these deep conversations about the issues of the day because we don't watch a lot of news, but things filter in, and so they ask questions about what is privilege, what's causing this racism, and they don't understand it from the perspective of having those feelings because they've been fortunate enough to have been in environments, very diverse environments as they've grown up, from an either economic or racial or even religious environments. They've learned to appreciate people for being people, and I, so it's when I have to answer questions for them is when I start to see some of that patterning in myself that I didn't even know was there. So I think it's fascinating to go through that study of it, like with the Mankind Project, and be able to pull it out or have it pulled out for you. So take us a little bit deeper now into this idea. So we've kind of been started very high level. Take us deeper into where you see we are right now and how this plays and why we have to find this word and go deeper into that.
Sure. Well, there seem to be two main voices on this topic today. And it's a little bit of an oversimplification because there are more than two, but the main voices, one seems to be captured by the restoration of dignity that Black Lives Matter is meant to represent. And the other is in many ways summarized by a quote from Morgan Freeman, which he said this on a 60 Minutes interview, I think decades ago. How do we stop racism is what he was asked. I think Mike Wallace was introducing him or dialoguing with him. And he said, stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. So these two voices around this issue, one voice is basically saying, you need to recognize, the world needs to recognize that a specific group of people, in the current context, Black people, but in different settings, it's been different groups. But right now, Black people are treated differently by many other people than most people realize, and differently in a negative way. And then the other group saying, wait a second, if we keep focusing on our differences, we're going to miss our similarities. And my fear is that what people do with this topic is what they have been doing for a long time with politics topics, where they fall into this undeveloped cognitive or thought process where it's either or. It's either or. It's this or it's that. There is no both and. And when there is either or, there's increasing divisiveness, increasing polarization, increasing hatred from both sides toward the other side. And when there is a both and attitude, then we start seeking the wisdom underneath both perspectives, and we dare to have the courage to start looking at the question of how do we integrate, how do we synergize both of these perspectives. So that's my take on what I'm witnessing between these two main camps in the racism conversation right now.
So for some people that might be struggling to understand the two camps, and maybe they're sitting in one versus another. Do you have an example from history that we might be able to look back at some distance now, kind of taking that telescopic view to say, look back here when the world or part of the world was like this on this particular issue, but now we can see the both and aspect of it?
Sure. So let's go back to the war in Vietnam. So let's pick something in relatively recent history.
Right.
So back in the 1960s, I grew up in the 50s and the 60s. And back in the 1960s, there was a lot of societal polarization around the war in Vietnam. And in my high school, there were people who wore black armbands to protest the war. And in my high school, they were labeled the hippies. And there was another group of people in my high school who wore white armbands to protest the protesters. And they, in my high school, got labeled the greasers because they wore, slicked back hair sometimes, and some of them were really into things like auto mechanics and stuff like that. And of course, both terms, the hippies and the greasers, those were used as negative terms by the other group. This was a bad thing. If you were a hippie, it was a bad thing if you were a greaser. If you were a greaser, right, it was a bad thing if you were a hippie. And what we discovered after the war in Vietnam had ended was that this whole generation of young people who had served in the military from the United States in Vietnam had come back from the war. They were shunned, they were ridiculed, they were attacked, they were ostracized. They were a target group. And over time, the people who were in the quote unquote hippies group started to realize that they had gone overboard. And over time, many of the people in the quote unquote greasers group started to realize they had gone overboard, that maybe this war was not a wise thing to wage, given how many Americans came back in body bags. And the hippies realized maybe this wasn't such a good idea to vilify everyone who served in the armed forces in Vietnam, because we harmed a whole bunch of people who were serving their country based on the country's foreign policy decisions. So that's an example of moving from the either or to the both and.
I love that example, because it's something that for many of the people that are watching this and listening, and that they have probably a real connection to it from the perspective that they lived at the time, or they have a family member or maybe multiple family members that served or lived in that and can talk about the reality of it. I was born in the mid 70s, so after it was essentially over at that point. But I had several uncles, and my wife has several uncles that had served there, and variety of experiences, and many of them have not talked about it, because of what they experienced over there and coming back here, which I think we can see in many ways is very different today when we look at the soldiers coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and there's still some divisiveness there, but it doesn't seem to me, at least, anywhere near what we saw even in the movies of the 80s and the late 80s, early 90s, and how they were portraying it at that point in time. So I appreciate that example. Thank you. That helps kind of put it in context.
Yeah, and just to add a little addendum to that, if I might, when I was 16, I reached what I will often refer to as the Popeye point from the old Popeye cartoons. Just before he reaches for his spinach, he says, "That's all I can stand. I can't stand no more." And I reached the Popeye point with this polarization in my high school. So I started to think, what can I do to bring these two groups together? And I came upon what I thought was a brilliant idea in my youthful naivete. And I recruited my mom to sew something that I didn't know how to sew, which was a black armband and a white armband that were sewn together into one thicker armband. And across both, the black and the white parts of the armband was emblazoned this word anti-polarization. So my mom finishes putting together this armband, and I wear it to school the very first time, and I'm really proud of this, and I'm really happy to finally be taking a stand and making this statement and hoping that this is what is going to bring these two groups together in dialogue. And sure enough, shortly after I arrive at the high school, I'm circled by a group of greasers and a group of hippies. And they all start yelling at me at the same time with the exact same message. You're a coward, you're refusing to take a stand, and they were all on me. Both sides were on me about this storyline that I was being a coward who was refusing to take a stand. And in the middle of being on the receiving end of this, I had this kind of aha light bulb experience. And I realized, you know what, David? You got your wish. You wished for the wrong thing. You got them talking to each other. You got them speaking as one voice, but you did it in a way that caused you to get crucified.
Yeah, I couldn't help
And
but
that
laughing because I knew where
started
that
me
story
on
was
a
going.
journey.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, laugh. I mean, it is very humorous because it's from that, youthful, naive perspective, but it started me off on a journey. That was the day that I knew I was post-partisan. I knew that I was not wired to be in both, in either or thinking, that it had to be integrative. It had to be both and. And so it really set the course of my societal awareness from then forward. So that's kind of the punchline on the Vietnam story.
Well, I want to dive a little bit deeper because I appreciate your ability to see and explain very complex issues, I think, in a very easy to understand way without oversimplifying. Um, you and I've had conversations many times about this integrative thinking and an integrative logic. I read a book. It's actually on my nightstand right now because I was going back and rereading it again. Um, Probably 15 years ago, I think, is when I first got the book, maybe 20 years ago. But it's all about integrative thinking, and they use it they speak about it from perspective of business. So not this and not that. How do we bring both models together and really come up with a new way of doing things? So can you talk to us a little bit in depth? Because I think it's going to be a foundation that we got to use as we move forward in our discussion here. What is integrative thinking? And before you answer that, I just want to say, if you're watching and you have a question or want to drop a comment in the chat box, please do so, because I'm more than happy. I'm monitoring the comments here, and I'm more than happy to ask Dr. David Gruder the question that you have for him. So if you don't mind talking a little bit about integrative logic or integrative thinking. You are muted, by the way. Sorry.
Well, that's a very good point, isn't it? Yes. So integrity, of course, is about being whole and complete. That's, if you look in the dictionary, that is one of the definitions of the word integrity, the state of being whole and complete. So integrative thinking or integrative thinking is thinking that includes multiple perspectives and then ties those perspectives together into a coherent picture. If I contrast that with divisive thinking, the one way to I want to use the word radicalism, but I want to use it in the way that it's used in society, as opposed to the original dictionary definition of the word, which is quite different from how it's used. But radicalism is used today generally as the same word as extremism. And what radicalism or extremism is, in contrast to integrative thinking, is the insistence that the part of a bigger picture that I see is the whole picture, and that all other perspectives are illegitimate at best and a threat at worst. That's the opposite of integrative thinking. It's the opposite of clarity, and it's antithetical to personal and societal sanity. That kind of insistence that the part of the picture that I see is the whole picture is the formula for polarization and divisiveness that adds more fuel to a beliefs war that has emerged between one half of the picture and the other half of the picture, no matter what picture we're talking about. And that's counterproductive at best and harmful at worst.
Thank you. I think that gives a really simple but clear description and definition of what it is. So let's dive deeper now into, so we don't have a word that is the opposite of racism, but what are those characteristics that you've seen so far that you would include, in part at least, in that?
Sure. I look at 3 dimensions that are important in and of themselves and that have to be laced together in order to create a whole picture. The first dimension is the me dimension. That has to do with me being self-awake, me becoming the change I want to see in the world. The second, and we can dive into the details of all of this later. The second dimension is intracultural responsibility. Me inside whatever cultures I identify with, taking responsibility for speaking up with my own people about the change I want to see. And the third is intercultural unity, which is about containing words and behaviors that undermine collaboration among groups and nourishing systemic well-being rather than systemic divisiveness and systemic unconsciousness, for that matter. So it's that combination of self-awakeness, intracultural responsibility, and intercultural unity that looks to me, at least so far, as like the recipe for gracism instead of racism.
Okay, so it's me understanding myself, my belief systems, my paradigms, my patterns, any whatever words we want to use.
And my biases, my unconscious, unowned biases.
Okay, perfect. So there's the looking inward at me. Then there's the looking outward with the group that I identify with whatever, we don't have to be talking racism, we can talk about anything, and having that conversation with them.
When they're misbehaving, taking responsibility to clean up my own people.
Right, which means I have to look inward first. So that's the foundation. I have to look inward first, then speaking out amongst my own group and making sure that sharing what I have become aware of myself, and then looking out beyond my group to all groups and finding the unity between them. Is that fair enough?
You got it.
Okay.
Those are the 3 ingredients that I see so far.
So what I find interesting about that, relating back to very early in our conversation here, we talked about Black Lives Matter, right? It's there's a celebration of the uniqueness of the culture of them as a people, that group as a people. And I don't say that group in a derogatory way. I mean it as an identifier. And then you've got the Denzel Washington approach from the perspective of, let's look at what's similar between us. So you're in a sense respecting all aspects of this and bringing the best out of it. So, okay, I had to work through that in my mind, so I make sure I've got it on target, and hopefully everyone hears that.
Yeah, you've got it. And I hope everyone hears it too. But you've got it perfectly. It's the both and. They're both right, and
Yes.
they're both incomplete unless they're combined.
Yes. Yeah. So we have the, let's go a little bit deeper into each three of the components then, just so we can dive deeper. Like, so what does it mean to be awake to self? There's a lot of ways that term is used today, and I know in some of the circles that I kind of migrate into and out of every now and then, being woke or awoke or awaken is not a positive term. It's a term of targeting, if you will. It's not always positively used. So let's talk about what that really means from your perspective, and let's get some clarity around that.
Sure. It means a few things. The first is that I commit to cleaning up my own negative programming by waking up to the forms of racism, privilege, targetedness, powerlessness, and power abuse and authority issues that I've been unaware of or have tolerated in myself. I stop oppressing others to compensate for my own inner oppression and authority issues and fear of powerlessness and feelings of insufficiency. That's a really important part, because a lot of us have an internal oppressor. Oftentimes, it's called our inner critic, right?
What? I
So,
don't have one of those. I don't know what you're talking about.
well, let me sit at your feet and have you teach me what that's like. And I acknowledge that until I deal with these dynamics inside me, and the root causes of these, that I carry inside me, I'll continue to pretend that covert bias out in the world, the hidden bias out in the world, doesn't exist, instead of advocating and becoming a part of systemic transformation. So, for example, I'll give you an example of unconscious bias tied to the experience I had when I was 13. So, my wife was raised Catholic. All right. So I didn't generalize from that experience with those boys to all Catholics. At the same time, when I am in a room full of strangers or out in public in a group of strangers, I didn't realize for the longest time that I was unconsciously scanning for people who had looks on their faces that looked angry or menacing to me in ways that reminded me of those particular boys that beat me up. And I didn't scan for blacks. I scanned for whites. I
Interesting.
didn't scan for girls, women. I scanned for boys, for men. So I was scanning for white men who had menacing looks on their faces. And I would go on hyper alert around that until I finally woke up to the fact that I was carrying unconscious bias as an unrecognized vestige of an otherwise healed trauma.
Interesting. So trauma is a big part, I think, at least from my experience, a big part of what causes us to do the scanning, that we can recognize the bias that's deep within us, and that trauma does not have to be caused by something we experienced ourselves. At least this is my experience of it. It could be the trauma that someone else experienced, and then we hear their story and we pick up on their emotional state, which then can traumatize us to some extent. Is that an accurate way to look at it?
That's absolutely accurate. So, as a psychologist, part of my training is in traumatology. So I have some background in not only identifying but treating trauma. And the version of trauma you're describing actually has a name. It's called vicarious traumatization. And people who are first responders often end up having to treat vicarious traumatization. They get traumatized by being in direct contact with people who are themselves trauma victims and assisting them. They're not inflicting trauma on these victims. They're there to rescue them or to aid them or to mend them, repair them, to serve them. And they get traumatized simply by the fact that they are serving traumatized people. Vicarious traumatization.
Interesting. I find it really interesting because there are, I know in my experience, so I'll just use Nashville here as an example. We had the flood in 2010, March 2nd or 3rd this year, just before the whole COVID lockdown happened. We had a tornado that came through and did some massive devastation. And, in those situations, we were impacted by the flood directly. Our house was flooded in that. But the tornado didn't hit us directly. So we were out there, my daughters and I were out there, helping serve in that. And I found two things happen that I can identify. There's probably a lot more, but the first was the recognition that these people didn't deserve what happened to them. And dealing with that, I think that age-old conflict of how could God allow something like this to happen, right? There's that kind of element there, and that's kind of the initial reaction I felt. And then there was a sense of anger. And if it may have been something else first, but it was anger pretty quickly. And it was anger because there were certain areas of town, of Nashville here, North Nashville in particular, that were completely ignored by the media. And when the media finally showed up, because they were called out on Twitter and Facebook and things like that, they simply went to the areas where the supplies were being distributed and help was being offered and a lot, but they ignored the neighborhood as a whole. And this neighborhood, North Nashville, is predominantly Black and other minorities, very low income. Many of them are working, so they're not, living off the government, if you will. They're actually in jobs, they're renting and that. But it literally right across the interstate. The interstate cut this neighborhood about probably 40 or 50 years ago to build the beltway around Nashville. And they're exactly on the other side of the interstate from where everything that hit the national news with all the 10-year-old high rises and everything else, all these beautiful areas that hit the news, but the news crews didn't cross the road, didn't go on the other side and see all these homes, 50, 60, 70-year-old homes without roofs that had collapsed and everything else. And those were ignored. And even when they did show up there, they didn't actually go through the neighborhoods. They didn't show what was actually happening. And so for me, and, I sense that how could this happen today? And that was one of the things that I know has moved me significantly. And so it's an element that, I didn't experience the trauma, but I experienced what these people were going through. So I think that vicariousness of it, and I don't claim it as like, gosh, I need to go get treated or anything else. It was an awakening moment for me, honestly, to see that and to recognize that
Right.
this is happening today.
So we might not call that vicarious traumatization. We might call that vicarious awakening.
That's probably true. Yes.
Yeah. Great example. Great example. Is it okay if I move forward with other parts of the internal work? So the second part is about modeling. I am always representing my tribe, whatever tribes I identify with, right? I am always, as a psychologist, I am always representing psychologists. As a white man, I'm always representing white men, right? As a Jew, I'm always representing Jews. And this was drilled into me when I was very, very young, that I had a responsibility to present my best self to society, because there were so many negative stereotypes about Jews that the only way to counter those stereotypes was to represent in myself the best of my people, not the worst of my people. That it was drilled into me that if I behaved badly, I was not only harming myself, I was not only doing self-destructive things, I was contributing to anti-Semitism.
Wow.
So this whole notion of I'm always representing my tribe and I take responsibility for representing it at its best and for repairing any damage I inadvertently inflict when I don't do this. That's a level of self-awakeness and self-responsibility, or an aspect of it, that's very important, the modeling piece.
Yeah, that piece is not talked about enough, I think, at least in the when people talk about awakeness, they're not talking about that aspect of it quite frequently. And
Quite frequently.
it gets lost in that in the conversation, because they're trying to represent only a portion of awakeness.
Yes. And I've watched quite a number of videos of very in my judgment, very thoughtful Black people talking about how upset they are with elevating into almost sainthood status Black people who have been clearly mishandled and abused and even killed by others, as though the mistreatment by itself isn't legitimate enough or important enough to stand on its own. That these particular videos that I've watched are about these particular folks saying how angry they are that that not so good people are being turned into saints. And their whole point is about this modeling. We need to be models first.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you want to say
No,
something
go
before?
ahead. I'm processing. Sorry.
No, sorry at all. I just didn't want to go on to the next dimension too quickly. The next dimension is self-management. And I refer to it as untriggerability, where I refrain from both power abuse and power phobia. There are a lot of people who have been on the receiving end of enough power abuse that they've decided to go to the equally and oppositely dysfunctional extreme, where they run away from their personal power because the only exposure they've had is to dysfunctional or tyrannical power. And so in self-management, I refrain from both of those, from both power abuse and power phobia, being afraid of my power. I step into healthy personal power rather than tolerate or justify things that I say and do when I allow my reptile brain to be the boss of my words and actions. So a lot of people don't really understand that when we're in our right mind, when we're really thinking clearly, we're able to be good choice makers. But when we are in an activated, triggered state, our body actually generates stress chemicals, norepinephrine, adrenaline, cortisol, that shoot straight from our gut up to our brain. And their function in our brain is to turn off the thinking part of our brain, our cortex, and turn on the reptile part of our brain. And the reptile part of our brain, the limbic system, is it only has a repertoire of 4 possible reactions: fight, flight, flee, run away, freeze, deer in the headlights, or faint, play possum, and hope that the threat will become disinterested and move on. Fight, flight, freeze, faint. That's the entire repertoire of the reptile in us. And when we don't have an awake relationship with whether we are in our thinking self or our reptile self, we're going to be doing really nasty stuff without even knowing we're being nasty until after we've come back to our senses because we've been triggered. And we have to remember that our emotional charges, the emotional charges that I have with other people, are a doorway into spotting and resolving my own baggage. They're projections. That doesn't mean there aren't bad things, bad behaviors that need to be contained, corrected, restrained. There are behaviors that need to be contained. But if I, on top of an unacceptable behavior that needs to be contained, then go into rage and abuse, that's reptile brain. And when I go into rage and abuse, the rage and abuse is about me, not about them. The containment of unacceptable behavior is about them. My triggeredness is about me. And that's a level of self-responsibility that is absolutely crucial. It's the core of self-management of my thoughts and emotions, because when unless I am in self-management of my thoughts and emotions, I am not able to productively participate in nonviolent engagement and repair.
It's fascinating to think about the chemistry, the brain chemistry that's happening, and the wiring that's engaged, and as you said, the reptile brain, because we often in the moment have very little free will, let's say it that way. Especially when the emotions kick in, we're kind of going down a predictable path. And I had this discussion with one of my daughters actually just the other day, where I liken it like, in the moment here, we often have very little free will if we've been in an emotional state. But what we can do is we have a lot of free will for choosing a future moment and how we're going to prepare for a future moment. And trying to use that as an example of, if I'm hungry and I'm on a diet, it's really hard for me to behave, but if I go ahead.
So I need to speak up here because it looked like you were saying absolutely marvelously interesting things, and I couldn't hear a word you said
Oh,
because of my internet connection.
okay. So let me
Can
go
you
back.
hear me?
Yes, I could hear you.
You're able to hear me, but I'm not able to hear you.
Can you hear me at all now?
So I'm going to see if stopping my video and starting it up again will help. Hang on a second.
Sure. So for those of you watching, we have a
No,
slight
you're
technical
still frozen.
difficulty.
I think what I need to do, if you'll hang in there, Tony, speak again, see if I can hear you now.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay.
Can't hear you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to exit and I'm going to come back in. So
Okay.
you stand by. I'm going to come right back in.
Awesome. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Having a little bit of a technical difficulty on his side, but we will have Dr. David Gruder back here in just a second. Hopefully everything will be working as soon as he comes back in. So if you have any questions or comments or thoughts that have come to you as we've been discussing this, drop them in the chat. What are your thoughts about this? What are your thoughts about what he's bringing up, and everything from the integrative thinking to where we're at now, where we're diving into these three different components of what is the opposite of racism, and what is that word that we could use that he doesn't even know yet, but we're getting to the point where we're going to be able to talk about that. Hey, Stacy, it's great to see you. Hey, Kenton, good to see you. Kristen, good to see you as well. I know there's several others that have come and probably gone by this point, but that's great to see you guys dropping in. And we're just let me see here if he's popped back in. Not yet. So again, any questions you may have. So I'll talk a little bit about David Gruder, Dr. David Gruder while he gets there. Wait, he might be back. Let me check. Can you hear me, David?
I can hear you now, finally. I had to exit out of out of Zoom altogether and then reopen it.
Awesome. Okay, so we are reconnected. Good, and we didn't lose your sound at all. So we got your whole point up there. So, trying to go back to where I was at in there. So, one of the things that you were talking about is the ability to make the decision, the reptile brain, and that. So that the brain chemistry, the brain wiring, really intrigues me. And one of the conversations, I see you're frozen. Can you still hear me? Are we connected yet? I think I may have lost you again, David. Are you still there? Sorry, folks. It's technology. We're live. This is exactly what happens on occasion. So we're hopefully going to have David with
now
us.
You're
there.
back.
There we
You're
are.
back.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I've got you as well. So, okay, we'll work through this. You know, we're moving along. It's good. So I was just using the example that I was talking with my daughters the other day, and I said, you know, if you think about free will is very limited in the moment, often because our emotions are really in control. And so we have very limited real ability to say yes or no to something. We're pretty much on a predictable path at that point. And I know people will argue with this. I was raised thinking you had free will at a maximum all the time in every moment, right? But then what I do describe is, I said, you have much more free will if you're looking to a future moment and saying, how can I modify my behavior, my habits, and things in the future so that if I'm ever in the situation again, I can make a different choice, or I can follow a different path. And to me, it sounds a bit like that when you're describing the reptile brain and what's happening, because if we do get to that point of fight, flight, freeze, or faint, then there isn't much we can do at that point. It's a reaction is all it is.
The only thing we can do is take a time out.
Yeah. If we're aware enough to take that time out, right? So yeah. So let's dive a little deeper into the next element here. Did you have any more on the personal awakeness side, or do you want to go to the next element?
The last piece I want to say is on the personal piece is about impact literacy, because this is a really big issue today around illiteracies. You know, people regularly, we don't recognize when there's a disconnect between my good intentions and the way that my words or actions are landing on other people. And impact literacy is about aligning intentions, words, and actions. So the self-responsibility piece there is that I seek to recognize when there is a disconnection between my intentions and my impacts, so I can recognize and repair my unintended negative impacts and discover how to have positive impact with my positive intentions more effectively in the future, just like you were talking about. That, you know, free will only goes so far, and beyond that, it becomes a theory, not actually. If it falls in a category that I refer to as true but not useful, that where the free will is I have the free will to learn or not learn valuable lessons from here and now experiences that help me be more authentic, more loving, and more positively impactful in the future. That I have free will to choose, right, or to do or not do.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I like the way you describe that.
So that's the whole self-responsibility picture. Now I'm ready to move to the second dimension, which is the courage to elevate intracultural responsibility, which I refer to as speaking up with my own. And we've pretty much talked about that, you know, that my commitment is to challenging the isms within the groups of which I'm a part. So let me give you an example of that. What I see in all kinds of groups is that people who are part of a particular group and are on the extreme fringe, or are misbehaving in some way, they're often given what's called pass cards. Oh, they're there. They're just kind of being wiggy. They're just having a bad day. Or we could go even further. Well, I understand why they're doing such nasty things. Um, that it's not really cool that they're doing that, but I get it. And it's another form of a pass card where the extremism within a tribe is kind of validated or tolerated. And we see this in political parties, we see this in religions, we see this in all kinds of ideologies. We see it in science, where junk science is tolerated or fudging the data is tolerated. We see it in the police force, which, in my experience, in having worked to some extent with police in the past, the vast majority of police are incredibly well-intended, good-hearted people who truly take seriously the mandate to protect and serve everyone. And at the same time, when another police officer misbehaves, there's a tendency to go, they're there, they're just under the stress of their job. Right? And that's not just true of police. It's true of teachers. It's true of construction workers. It's true of psychologists. Pick your profession. It's true.
Yep.
And that willingness, that commitment to challenging isms within my own groups is a really crucial part of having the courage to elevate intracultural responsibilities. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think my thought that I want to share here might bridge between both the intracultural and intercultural. And that is that Dr. Paul Zak has some amazing research he's done. He has a book called The Moral Molecule, and he's done a lot of research around oxytocin and the effect of oxytocin on us as a bonding neuropeptide, I believe would be the right term. And one of the things he points out in his book is that with certain types of groups, typically fundamentalists or groups that have a very tight bond where their code, their orthodoxy, things like that. So it's not just religion, but it could even be like the Navy SEALs as an example. There's anything with a tight bond. They often are triggered when something happens to their group or something happens that would offend their group. And one of the things that's triggered is testosterone. And what he points out is that when this testosterone is triggered, it actually blocks oxytocin from being able to plug into the receptors so that they cannot feel a bond with those in other groups. They cannot actually, they tighten their bond with each other, and they cannot bond with those who are different. And so it's an interesting thing, and I say it kind of, I think, bridges both of these that we're talking about here, because from an intracultural perspective, if someone's threatening my group, my testosterone, I know it as a father, someone threatens my kids, it kicks in and I've got to calm myself down. Right. And so in that case, I bond with my kids more tightly, and I repel everything else around me. And I'm not willing to look necessarily at the why behind it, the similarities, what they might have meant rather than what I heard them say, and I think that that's something that we don't pay enough attention to, or even maybe aren't aware of. And then it causes us to really break down any unification that was there prior to, between groups. So that's why I say it's almost like one of these things that bridges between the two things that you're talking about here, the intra and inter.
Yes, and that's why these are we're going over three ingredients that need each other. They can only be kind of separated for the sake of conceptual clarity, but in reality, in real life, they interweave. They're very connected to each other. That's beautiful. That's really well said, because an overabundance, an excess of testosterone leads to aggressiveness and dysfunctional competition, the form of competition that says, I I have to win, and that means you have to lose, right? Um, and of course, when people are in excess testosterone, there is no physiological access to bonding, there to oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone, as you know, and as some of our listeners may now be learning, perhaps for the first time. Uh, so, should we move into the
Yeah.
intercultural?
Yeah, let's do. We actually have a lot of people that are watching and listening, but no one has commented at all. So I hope they're absorbing it because they're staying with us. So that's a good thing, I guess.
Yeah, it is, and if as in our discussion, we're revealing blind spots that we don't know we have, I really hope that the people who are watching will enter comments to alert us to any of those potential blind spots. Because, like I started off saying at the very beginning, this is a draft. This is not final copy. It's a draft. So the third is the wisdom to support intercultural unity. And that's about containing the unacceptable and nourishing systemic well-being rather than divisiveness. So where this starts for me is with a bias that I am very transparent about having, which is I am not a fan of political correctness. I view political correctness as a cover-up of immorality that forces racism and other isms underground. And what I recognize is that political correctness is not cultural medicine, it's cultural malpractice. In contrast, kindness and respect is not political correctness, it is human decency. And I embrace that human decency is the cultural and that we remove. And human decency makes futile attempts to enforce political correctness unnecessary. So I therefore commit to replacing political correctness with kindness and respect.
That's a really fascinating perspective, because political correctness has been such a challenging thing to deal with, I think, for so many people. Um, not I would say I'll speak from my own experience. Like there are issues that I want to speak about, issues that I think are important for us to have conversations about, but speaking about them as I believe I should, I know I'm going to be attacked. And I don't know the right language to use, what's politically correct in the moment, so that instead of people focusing on the language or a the wrapping paper, which with I'm trying to deliver a gift. I'm trying to think of a good analogy here, right? They're looking at that and they're saying, I don't like, Santa Claus on my wrapping paper because that's not appropriate for me. And so, it's a challenging thing, but I think we have to pull that out, because if we don't address it, as you said, with kindness and decency, and start with that as our foundation, the political correctness goes, in a direction that is, we're unable to have conversations and to get to the truth of the
Right.
situation.
Sometimes what I have found myself saying in conversations related to what you're talking about is, um, I know what's in my heart. What's in my heart is, and then I just simply speak my heart. Like, I'm in pain over this, or I am yearning for something better, or whatever short thing I can say about what's in my heart, following which I say, I don't know how to put that into words in a useful way. So teach me, how can I express this part of my heart to you in a way that is hearable?
So I'm fully transparent. I'm gonna share something here that where I struggle.
Mm-hmm.
I experience this, that, and I'm going to use labels of conservative versus liberal, not to try to cast anyone, but because people will understand the concept.
Sure. Good example.
What I've seen happen often is that conservatives tend not to want to have emotional conversations or conversations that involve emotion. They want to go down the path of statistics and what they would call facts. And in some sense, in their conversations, the experience of life itself is left out. That's my perspective. And then when I turn, and in conversations with liberals, I see the experience of life itself, the phenomenology of the moment is what's talked about without the statistics and some of those facts. And I sit in the middle of these, recognizing value on both sides and recognizing, incorrectness or incompleteness, maybe is a better way to say it, on both sides. And I've often said, I look at the Republicans and what they're promoting, and I say they're losing the ability to hold a true national office. Senate, that's a state office, if you will. They're elected at the state level. Representatives of the House are local or regional, if you will. But from a presidential perspective, they're losing the ability to really seek and the good things that they have on their platforms to support and all that, because they cannot be in touch with that emotional side. It's like when they get out there, they can't talk about it. It's like they I know they're good people because I know how they are at home. I know how they are with their kids. I know how they are around me. And then they get out here and it's like they've got to put a persona on that it's not really them, if you will. And I see on the other side, I see liberals doing exactly the opposite. They have very factual, statistical conversations in private, but when they get out in public, it's very emotionally and phenomenologically oriented, if you will. It's like in this moment, it's like, how do we address that? Because I think if we don't address that, we cannot address these isms in society. We've got to be able to talk from statistics and from emotions at the same time, and not, well, maybe we can be uncomfortable, but we can't dismiss the other side as, oh, you're too emotional, or, oh, you're just looking at the stats.
There's the both and again that you're asking about. So let me frame my response to you in the context of archetypes. So archetypes are prototypes or templates that capture aspects of what it is to be human, just for those who are listening that aren't familiar with that term. And among the core, the foundational, I shouldn't say core, but foundational archetypes are the masculine and the feminine consciousness archetypes, not about men and women. This is the feminine consciousness in both men and women, the masculine consciousness in both men and women, and any other gender identification that somebody might have. We all have both of these consciousnesses that are inside us. And the feminine consciousness is about nurturance. That's the form of love that feminine consciousness in all human beings takes. And that's about emotion. That's about emotion. Masculine consciousness in all human beings, the form of love that consciousness takes, is challenging. If I can draw upon a quote or a paraphrasing from a 20th century theologian by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr, he was saying that our task, our mission, is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Not one or the other, both and. Comforting the afflicted is feminine consciousness in men and women and all genders, feminine consciousness in all human beings. And afflicting the comfortable is masculine consciousness in all human beings. So if we if we are only in our heads and we leave our hearts out of the conversation, we are not being integral. We're not being whole and complete. We're emphasizing one aspect of ourselves and leaving out another aspect. If we are being only emotional and we're leaving our head out, we are not whole and complete. We're not in integrity. And so what has happened in political polarization is that conservatives, by and large, in my experience as a post or transpartisan, is they are very passionate about facts, about data. And their judgment of liberals is that liberals don't care about facts or data. They're all emotion driven. And on the other side of that fence, the liberals are angry at conservatives for seeming to be cruelly heartless, because they seem to be all head and all opposition, and whatever premise gets whatever position gets taken that's not in alignment with them, they're going to shred it to pieces. They're not going to have any compassion for the wisdom underneath what the other perspective is speaking about. That's the liberal kind of mentality. And what neither group appreciates is how much they need each other. What both groups appreciate is the shadow expression of these core traits. So the shadow expression of masculine challenging love, not men, masculine consciousness in all people, challenging types of love, is that it stops being love. The challenging becomes shaming and abusive and tyrannical and coercive. And same thing, opposite is true, which is that nurtures become indulgence that reinforces entitlement disorder. Both groups probably have a better grasp of the shadow side of the other group than the group themselves do. And both groups have probably a better sense of their own gold than the other group has about them. This is what needs to be repaired. And this ties into that other ism I mentioned, which is that political hatred is the only remaining form of group hatred that is today actually socially sanctioned, indulged, and applauded. And that is sick.
That is so well stated. I think there's a couple pieces that I want to pull out here and emphasize. You addressed both of these as the love, the way they share love. And so from the emotional side, it's the nurturing. From the masculine side, it is the challenge. And that to me just really stands out, is that they both are acting out of love potentially until they get to that more extreme, the shadow side of it. And as you said, that it is sanctioned. I hadn't thought about that until
Tony froze. Can
you hear me now?
Okay.
Can you hear me now, David? You're breaking up a little bit there. Your face is frozen on my camera. Okay, he's going to come right back, folks. Sorry about the technical difficulty here. It's a little, it's got a little Wi-Fi connection issue, I think, on that side, but he'll be back momentarily. So what are you taking away from this? Any comments that you want to share, and any insights that you have, or something that's occurred to you as you've listened on this conversation with Dr. David Gruder here with me? Good to see several of you joining us here. I appreciate Angie and Rachel and Frankie and that. Good to see you all here. just one more minute. He'll probably be back on here in just a second. So any takeaways from your perspective? We got a couple more things, probably just a few more moments here that we're going to talk. We got a couple things I want to ask him about and dig into a little bit deeper. And he is back with me here. Welcome back, David. I believe you are with me again. Can you hear me now?
I'm with you again.
Excellent. We have a time limit before they throw you back into the bad Wi-Fi zone, I guess.
I guess so, huh?
Yeah. So I was just reflecting on what you'd said, but I think the element of the socially sanctioned, what was the exact word you used there? Let me go back to you, just get your exact words.
Socially sanctioned hatred.
Socially
and
sanctioned
vilification.
Hatred. Yes. I think in my mind, I want to bring that to the light as we go through this next election cycle and call it out, because it is in my mind unacceptable that we as a country would allow that to exist. And if we want to model what it means to live in a free society, I think we have to address that right there. We can't get rid of any other racism or ism, if you will, if we don't address the willingness, because as I see it, if it's socially sanctioned across our society to hate the other side politically, there are groups within our society that then say, well, hey, if Republicans can hate Democrats and conservatives can hate liberals and vice versa, then I as a label the group, I can hate so-and-so, the other group out there. And so we cannot solve the problem if we don't call it out and hold people accountable when they do behave in that way.
Right. Totally agree. And here's my soundbite for that. Extremism is not the solution to extremism.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, did you have any further there? Because there's a comment I wanted to go back to and ask you one more question, at least quickly, because you said something earlier in the conversation.
Well, there are a couple of other dimensions that I wanted to touch on with the intercultural unity.
Yes,
if
perfect.
that's okay.
Please, yeah.
And one of them is exactly what we were just talking about, that extremism is not the solution to extremism. Integrative collaboration is. So, for example, even though I recognize that laws must be changed, policing must become elevated, unconscious systemic racism must be seen for what it is, of it be eliminated. I also recognize that morality cannot be legislated. It can only be facilitated. And so I therefore take responsibility for learning how to become a facilitator of these kinds of dialogues and to speaking up and taking action when others are being harmed, rather than standing by and watching the unacceptable unfold in front of my eyes.
That's powerful. That's powerful. And the line that stands out there to me is that morality cannot be legislated, only facilitated. I think that is in some sense at the heart of a lot of the conversations we have in this country of, well, that's not moral, or this is not moral. And to be able to understand that not everyone has the same moral code, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong. It's their systems, that beliefs that they were raised with. But there's an underlying moral fiber in all human beings that if they haven't been led astray, I think we all agree on. And so
Yes.
Facilitating that into the law rather than legislating the morality itself. I don't know if I said that clear enough, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah. What I would say is that the foundation of integrity is wired into who we are as human beings.
Mm.
It's trained out of us through undigested life experiences, aka otherwise known as traumas, where survival trumps integrity. And I'm not doing any kind of political statement there,
Yeah.
just using that word in its proper context. And those the fabric of our moral fiber revolves around our three core drives: our drive to be who we truly are, which
Hmm.
is our drive for authenticity, which translates into self-integrity, being in integrity with myself; the drive to bond with others, which is our drive for connection, which translates into relationship integrity; and the drive to influence the world around us, which translates into the drive for impact, which is about collective integrity, integrity with whatever groups we are part of, from smaller groups to nations to planets to humanity, as a
Right.
species. And so a whole and complete human being it's inwired into who how we're constructed as a species. We're a third about me, which is self-integrity; a third about we, which is relationship integrity; and a third about us all, which is about collective integrity. That's being whole and complete, and that is inwired in human beings, in
Hmm.
my experience. That's the moral code that every culture can agree on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do have a question that came up in the chat here, and it might take us a little bit off course of the last few points. So I'll ask the question and see
That's
where you want
okay.
to go with it. So
Sure.
Sylvia asks, what's the solution to white fragility?
White fragility. Thank you, Sylvia. Wow. Right. So I'm not remembering off the top of my head the author of this book, but there's a book called Anti-Fragile, which is a worthwhile book to read. The whole issue of fragility, because there's white fragility, there's black fragility, there's democratic fragility, there's republican fragility. It's fragility is a pandemic right now. And so honing in with that as the broader context into the antidote to white fragility is actually the look inside, where the moment that I become teachable at the level where I am willing to discover the ways in which I have, as a white person, unearned privilege, not to shame myself, just to recognize that I have unearned privilege that everyone ought to be able to enjoy just as much as me, but not everyone does. So I have, when I'm willing to recognize my unearned privilege and recognize the situations and contexts and circumstances in my life in which I have been the recipient of unearned targetness, where I've been an undeserving target of toxicity or being treated badly. When I am really in touch with my unearned privilege and my unearned targetness, I become anti-fragile. I'm no longer fragile because I can empathize with both. And I don't feel ashamed about either. That to me is the starting place for becoming anti-fragile as a white person.
That's powerful. That's powerful. So you brought up a point there, and I want to drill a little deeper because it's in my notes here as you were talking earlier. You said you brought up the term the unearned privilege, and you wanted to go back to that. So do you want to take that now, or do you want to pause for and go back to the last elements you were going to share, and then come back to unearned privilege at the end?
No,
Okay.
no, that's fine. So what's really important for people in privilege groups to realize, and there are all kinds of privilege groups there that go far beyond only racial privilege. There are groups that are privileged education-wise. There are groups that are privileged economically. There are groups that are privileged with specialized expertise. So, for example, when I have a plumber come to the house to repair a plumbing problem, they are a privileged group. They have a privilege of a set of knowledge and wisdom and experience that I'm bloody clueless about, right? So privilege is not inherently an evil thing. It's just what is. There are ways in which I am privileged, and there are ways in which I'm not. Some of my privilege is earned. So I wasn't handed my doctorate. That's earned privilege. My PhD in clinical and organizational development psychology is earned privilege. What comes with that is the necessity of my being aware that I can use that for the purposes of love, or I can use it as a weapon. I can use that to join with other people or to divide myself against other people. Every human being has certain forms of earned and unearned privilege. My belief is that in today's world, it is not any longer optional. It is absolutely mandatory that each one of us simply comes to awakeness about our ways of having earned and unearned privilege. So, for example, I have no privilege. Well, let me go backwards. When I was a teenager, I grew up in and around New York City, and I would take the subway, and I would go through parts of town that if my parents knew I was going through those parts of town, they would have a cow because they were scared that I was going to get mugged, right? That I was going to get killed. And in those particular parts of town, I owned zero privilege. I was not the privileged group. The Puerto Ricans were the privileged group in some parts of town. The Italians were the privileged group in some parts of New York. The Blacks were the privileged group in some parts of New York. The Irish were, keep going, just go down the list, right? And it was very powerful for me to be in parts of town where I had zero privilege. I was actually a target, potentially, right? So it's incumbent upon all of us to recognize our earned and unearned privilege, and to recognize that just because I have unearned privilege doesn't mean that everyone else does too. I have unearned privilege because I am a white male. I have privilege that my wife, who is a white female, does not have, because when she goes out by herself in public, she doesn't feel the level of physical safety in most circumstances that I feel. And that's not because she has unresolved trauma. She's not carrying unresolved trauma that either she or I are able to recognize. It's because there are aggressors out there that could be harmful. That's a form of privilege that I have as a white male that's unearned, and she does not have that level of unearned privilege as a white female. So it's important that we're all awake about the ways in which we have earned and unearned privilege, and that we are, again, like I said earlier, equally awake around the experiences we've had around being an unearned target, because that's the foundation of empathy.
So Sylvia follows it up, and this is I really like where you're headed with this. You get a lot more clarity around it's not just privilege, it's earned, it's unearned, and then you've got to look at the target side as well. I think that's brilliantly laid out there. So Sylvia follows up with this question: does unearned privilege mean the same thing as undeserved privilege?
Oh, great question. No. Unearned privilege is just data. Undeserved privilege is an editorial about the data. It's a judgment about the data. Unearned privilege is, I, as a white male, just as I live and breathe in a white dominant section of society, I have unearned privilege. If I go into another culture where whites are discriminated against, and they're in a one down minority, all of my unearned privilege is out the window. I've got no unearned privilege in that setting. So unearned privilege is just data. Undeserved is where white people go into guilt over their unearned privilege. Superman's grandmother, no, it wasn't Superman. I'm sorry. It was Spider-Man's grandmother who said, with great power comes great responsibility. Well, the same thing is true with privilege. With great privilege comes great responsibility. Notice that it wasn't with great privilege or with great power comes great guilt. It's not about guilt. If I have unearned privilege, how can I use that unearned privilege to elevate society? How can I use my unearned privilege to draw attention to those who do not share the unearned privileges that I have, so that I can advocate that they too get to enjoy the blessings of unearned privilege as well?
It's interesting because I'm glad that Sylvia asked that question too, because I think we can look around and see the conversations and the mixing of privilege, as you've already described, privilege versus unearned, or earned versus unearned, and they just encapsulate it as a one umbrella of privilege. And then there's the assumption that if it's unearned, it's undeserved, which is really into that whole element of guilt. And to be able to parse this out, and some people may say, oh, you're splitting hairs, but it's the difference between, as you said, I'll use my term in this case, it's like intellectually understanding I have privilege, and emotionally what I'm feeling about the fact that I have privilege.
Beautiful.
And I could say, because I have had these discussions, and I go back a year and a half ago, and someone had, who I respect them, I respect their opinion in that, but they said, you're privileged. And I resented it at first, and I went back and really had this long discussion. Said, I didn't walk until the age of 5. I didn't do this. I didn't have this. I didn't have this. All of these things. But what I didn't understand in that conversation, and could not illuminate in that conversation, is, yes, there is there's unearned privilege, which I have, but there's also a lot of earned privilege that I have. And then bringing in this element of undeserved privilege, I don't have to feel undeserving of any of it, but I do have to use it to elevate all.
Exactly. On a psychological level, let me bring this home one step deeper. What I will often ask people, very much apart from what we're talking about, but just by way of comparison, I will ask people, what are the prerequisites to deserving to feel love?
I don't have an answer. Being alive. I mean,
right. Well, some people will go into a whole long list of prerequisites, and the nature of the question, the reason I ask the question in the settings where I ask that question, is deliberately as a trick question for teaching purposes, because the answer to the question, what are the prerequisites to deserving to feel love, is none. Right?
exactly.
Because we are love. We are the result of love. That's the universal spiritual perspective, regardless of the spiritual tradition that one comes from. So there are no prerequisites to deserving to feel love. Well, that's another way of saying we all have unearned privilege. By virtue virtue of being human and being here, we are love. We are privilege. And if that unearned privilege is deprived, if we are deprived of our unearned privilege, we have been abused.
That does take it a lot deeper. And it reminds me of I've got some friends who recently had babies, and it takes me back 14, 16 years ago when I had my own babies, and it's like we hold these babies and we unconditionally love them, and it's like you can't do anything to deserve the love. I'm just it's there, and it's something that as kids grow up, and I've seen this in my daughters, there's a sense they get it from society around them, hopefully not from me, but who knows. I don't know everything I've unintentionally put into their environment. There's a point at which they start to think that they don't deserve love, or they have to earn love, and you can't. You can earn a lot of other things, but you can't earn love. And so it's really interesting to take this perspective and to understand. So thank you for diving deeper in that. I guess
let me just tie a bow around that.
Please.
I want to make sure that everyone who's watching this, who's a minority or a target group, is hearing me exactly as I'm saying what I said. That everyone who is in a minority or in a target group has been deprived of unearned privilege, and that is abuse.
Yes.
So I'm not speaking that as a privileged white male saying to others, if you deprive me of my unearned privilege, you're abusing me. That is not what I'm saying. I'm saying quite the opposite.
Thank you for clarifying that. Absolutely. Wow, we have covered a lot of ground. Is there any other pieces here that you wanted to go through? Because I have some questions popped up, but I'm like, I know we've got to cut off at some point here because we've been going for a while. And you and I have had, just for those who are still watching this, David and I have had some long conversations till maybe from, let's say, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. at points, and it's not uncommon when we are together. So we definitely could keep going for a long time.
True.
So did you have any last points or any elements that you wanted to bring up in to kind of wrap up with what we started with today?
I only have a closing quote that I want to offer, if I can somehow manage to pull it up for myself without disconnecting or freezing. But that'll be a final quote. I don't have anything else that I feel like I really need to cover that we haven't already covered so far. How about you?
We have covered so much ground, and there's questions that come up, but I think maybe a short answer, and we can go deeper in this another time. Is because I think this is relevant to the conversation too. So if those who have had their unearned privilege taken from them, and if we begin to recognize that is abuse, or that was abuse, how do we rectify that situation? I know that question's a big question, but what's a step or two in the direction? How do I, if you will, and I speak for anyone else watching this, how do I move in the direction of helping to reestablish what should be there?
Right. So where things get dicey is where I'm not going to go, things like restitution and things along those lines, because that becomes a very dicey kind of discussion to have. Where I'm going to answer the question is with what shouldn't be dicey. And if it is dicey, then there's something wrong with whoever makes it dicey. And that is simply acknowledgement. Yes, your unearned privilege was taken from you, or yes, your people's unearned privilege was taken from your ancestors, or whatever happens to be true. So the simple acknowledgement, I recognize this, I know this, it was not acceptable. It was abuse to have your unearned privileges or your ancestors' unearned privileges, or both, deprived. And what I can do as a human being, apart from policy questions that could be debated till the cows come home, what I can do as a human being is I am committed to making sure that I treat you with the same unearned privilege that I enjoy. I can make that commitment to you, human being to human being. I can make the commitment to you that I will do my best to stay awake about when I lapse back into, or when I realize afterwards that I lapsed back into unconscious bias. I can commit to my devotion to staying awake about those things, or coming back to awakeness if I fall asleep temporarily. That's where we can start. And if that point is a debatable point, there's something wrong.
Well said. And it's the clarity of that will get us moving in the right direction. And as you said, the other questions are dicey, but if we take the steps in the direction, I think the diciness, the lack of clarity will resolve itself. It's like the lamp that leads the way. We will begin to understand, but we can't solve that today because we don't even have people all looking the same way and recognizing that as human beings, person to person, this is what we should do.
Exactly. And that's why I put the portion of my intellectual property called the Reconciliation Roadmap into the public domain as a gift, because that is a step-by-step procedure for having difficult conversations about touchy topics in good ways.
Yes. If you're watching this, I know you have a quote to kind of close us out here with. But if you're watching this in the show description, there is a link to the draft of the content that we've been talking about tonight. So on Dr. Gruder's website, so go ahead to that link. You can see it there, read it there in more depth, and if you have questions, of course, reach out to Dr. David Gruder. And I gotta say, I am honored and humbled to have you here today. The conversation you've taken us through, just like every conversation that you and I have, it elevates me. It helps me to see things much more clearly than I saw them before. And I am so grateful. Sylvia says, great discussion. Thank you. So with that, I'll hand the floor back to you.
I'm glad, Sylvia. Thank you. And I hope a lot of people will end up watching the recording of this at various points in time. The closing quote I want to give is from in a TV series. The TV series is one of the Star Trek series, Star Trek Discovery. Who says this quote? Her name is Commander Michael Burnham, and she is a Black woman, just for those of you who don't watch Star Trek or haven't seen Star Trek Discovery. This comes out of that character's mouth. The only way to defeat fear is to tell it no. No, we will not take shortcuts on the path to righteousness. No, we will not break the rules that protect us from our basest instincts. No, we will not allow desperation to destroy moral authority. We have to be the torchbearers, casting the light so we may see our path to lasting peace. That is who we will always be.
Well said. Well said. Thank you again, David. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on here. And I look forward to our next discussion and very likely another one of these live broadcasts.
I will look forward to it as well. Thanks again so much for having me, Tony, and for having such a wonderful back and forth in our discussion, too.